Somewhere in the British Ordnance Survey archives, there is a map. It's dated 1944. It shows a section of the Normandy coastline, and it is accurate in almost every detail. Almost. One stretch of beach, one specific location, a water depth reading. The real depth, 8 feet. What the map says, 5 feet. The man who drew that map knew it was wrong. He drew it wrong on purpose. He spent 3 weeks making every other detail as accurate as he possibly could, so that one deliberate error would be invisible inside the surrounding truth. When the war ended, he didn't correct it. The map went back into the archive. Official. Stamped. Filed. Wrong. For decades it sat there. Wrong in exactly the way it was supposed to be wrong. And the man who drew it spent the rest of his life asking himself a question he couldn't quite answer. Not, was it wrong? He knew it was wrong. But, was it right? Subscribe right now, because this story is about the specific weight of a deliberate mistake and what it costs to carry it for 50 years. Spring 1944. The planning for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, was in its final stages. The largest amphibious operation in history. 5 beaches, multiple corps, thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men. But running alongside that planning, quietly in a different set of offices, was another operation. Operation Bodyguard. The name came from a Churchill quote, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." Bodyguard's purpose was specific. Make the Germans wrong about where the invasion was going to land. Not just keep them in the dark, actively mislead them. Create a coherent false picture. Build a world that looked real enough from the outside to be believed. To do this, every available tool was used. Fake radio traffic. Signals suggesting the presence of divisions that didn't exist, moving in ways that pointed toward the wrong beaches. Fictional armies. The 1st United States Army Group, commanded by General Patton, assembled entirely from signals intelligence and carefully managed aerial photography that showed empty fields and inflatable tanks. Double agents, German spies who had been turned by MI5 and were feeding their handlers in Berlin a diet of controlled disinformation. And maps, carefully crafted surveys of coastal sections that the Allies had no intention of using. Official-looking, professional, stamped with the authority of the Ordnance Survey, accurate in almost every detail. Almost. George William Marsh. Born in Cornwall, 1911. He grew up on the coast, the specific coast of southwest England. The kind where the relationship between land and water is never simple, where the tides run fast and the seafloor changes, and a sailor who doesn't know the local depths is a sailor who's going to run aground. Marsh grew up knowing those depths, not from study, from presence. From watching the water, from walking the tide line, from the specific knowledge that comes from being in a place and paying attention to it for years. He went to Cambridge. Geography, specializing in cartography, the science of representing reality on paper. How to capture 3-dimensional space in 2 dimensions. What to include and what to leave out. How to make a map that tells the truth about a place. Then the Ordnance Survey, Britain's national mapping agency, the institution responsible for the official geographic record of the country. Working for the Ordnance Survey meant working to a specific standard. Accuracy was not a goal, it was the baseline. You didn't try to be accurate, you were accurate or you did it again. Marsh was known among his colleagues for a specific quality. His maps didn't have errors. Not because he was lucky, but because he checked and rechecked and checked again. And because he had the specific temperament of someone for whom a wrong number on a map was a personal failure. Not just a professional one. When the war started, he was transferred to the Military Survey Division. Coastal analysis, beach gradients, water depths at various tidal states. What could be crossed, what couldn't. Where a landing craft would float and where it would ground. Every number mattered. People's lives depended on those numbers being right. In the spring of 1944, he was asked to make one of them wrong. March 1944. A briefing room, 2 officers, documents marked with the highest classification levels. The outline was clear. A section of the Normandy coast between the actual invasion beaches and the Pas-de-Calais region was to be presented to German intelligence as a potential landing zone. This presentation required supporting material, the kind of detailed coastal survey that the British would conduct before planning a major amphibious operation. Marsh would produce that survey. It needed to look exactly like the real thing. Ordnance Survey standard, professional methodology, all the elements of a genuine coastal assessment: beach gradients, approach routes, tidal patterns, obstacles, defensive positions. And in one specific location, one specific measurement needed to be wrong. Water depth at a designated point, 8 feet in reality, 5 feet on the map. The significance of that 3-foot difference was precise and calculated. A loaded landing craft of the type used in major amphibious operations required a minimum of 6 to 7 feet of water to operate without grounding. 5 feet meant impassable for that class of vessel. 5 feet meant you can't land here. A German analyst looking at this map and seeing 5 feet at that location would draw a straightforward conclusion. This beach doesn't work for a major landing. No preparation needed here. Marsh spent 3 weeks on the map. Every detail was handled with the precision of a man whose professional identity was bound up in accuracy. The beach gradients were real, drawn from genuine survey data. The approach roads were correct. The defensive positions reflected actual intelligence. The symbols followed standard British cartographic convention. The paper was right. The print quality was right. Everything was exactly what it would be if the map were genuine. And then, the number. Marsh held his pen over the water depth notation at the designated location. He knew the real number, 8 feet. He had the actual survey data in front of him. He wrote 5. He described that moment in a diary entry written much later. The entry is characteristically precise. My hand paused. 30 years of training against this? The whole of what I understand my work to be? Against this. And then I wrote it. Because I had understood something. This wrong could serve more than the right would. This wrong could serve more than the right would. He finished the map, checked everything else 3 times, filed it. The specific channel through which Marsh's map reached German intelligence is still classified. What is known is the general framework. Operation Bodyguard had multiple distribution channels for disinformation material. Double agents, German operatives who had been turned by MI5 and were feeding controlled information back to their handlers in Berlin. Diplomatic back channels, carefully staged recoveries of intelligence material designed to look like captures, and direct insertions through the networks that the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, maintained across occupied Europe. Marsh's map was one piece of a much larger package. It didn't travel alone. It traveled in the company of radio intercepts, agent reports, aerial photography, and other survey material, all pointing in the same direction, all consistent with each other, all building the same false picture. The German analyst who evaluated Marsh's map noted, consistent with other intelligence. He was right that it was consistent. Everything had been designed to be consistent. That was the point. A single anomalous document is suspicious. A consistent body of material that all tells the same story. That's intelligence. The water depth at that location, 5 feet. Beach unsuitable for major landing craft. Note filed, assessment completed. The analyst moved on to the next document. June 6, 1944, Allied forces went ashore on 5 beaches in Normandy. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, the German 15th Army. The strongest German formation in France, positioned in the Pas-de-Calais area, stayed in place for weeks, even after the landings in Normandy, even as it became clear that a major Allied offensive was underway. Why? Because German commanders, including Rommel, who was responsible for the defense of France, believed that Normandy was not the main effort, that the real invasion was still coming, that it would come at Pas-de-Calais. This belief was the product of bodyguard working, the fake army groups, the doubled agents, the false radio traffic, The consistent body of disinformation that had been built over months. And somewhere in that body of disinformation, 5 feet, one number on one map, part of a picture that told the Germans, not here. Let me stop here for a second. Marsh was a cartographer. His entire professional life, his entire identity, in a real sense, was built around accuracy, around the absolute obligation to represent reality correctly on paper. A wrong number on a map wasn't a minor error. It was a fundamental violation of what the work was for, and he was asked to put one there, deliberately, carefully, in a way that would make it invisible, and he did it. And then he wrote, "This wrong could serve more than the right would." That sentence is doing a lot of work. It's a utilitarian argument. The outcome justifies the action. The wrong number saves more lives than the right number would. But Marsh was a cartographer. His whole professional framework was built on the idea that the right number is always right, regardless of what it produces. Maps are true. That's what they are. So what does it mean when a man whose whole life is built around one value deliberately violates that value? For a good reason? Is he still the same man afterward? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely asking. And if this kind of story is worth your time, subscribe right now. Every day on this channel, hit the bell, tell me where in the world you're watching from. Let's go to the German side for a moment. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, was working hard in the months before D-Day to understand Allied intentions. The fundamental question was, where is the landing going to be? The answer to that question determined everything. Where to position the armored reserves, where to concentrate the coastal defenses, which sections of the Atlantic Wall to reinforce, and which could be held with lighter forces. Getting that answer wrong was catastrophic, and Bodyguard was specifically designed to make them get it wrong. From the German perspective, the intelligence picture in early 1944 pointed consistently toward Pas-de-Calais. The fictional 1st United States Army Group was positioned in southeast England, directly across the channel from Pas-de-Calais. The agent reports were consistent, the signals intelligence was consistent, and the coastal surveys were consistent. A beach survey showing 5 feet of water depth at a specific location told the German analyst, "The British have looked at this section of coast and concluded it isn't viable for a major landing, which means they're looking at it as a diversion at best. The real effort is elsewhere." The consistency was the point. One document is a clue. 10 documents that all say the same thing. That's a pattern. And patterns are what intelligence analysis runs on. Marsh's map was one thread in that pattern. One wrong number contributing to a wrong picture that the Germans held onto with enormous strategic consequences. The war ended. 1945. Bodyguard was classified. Marsh was bound by the Official Secrets Act, and the map went back to the archive. Uncorrected. 5 feet still there. Official stamp. Date mark. Filed. Marsh understood the situation precisely. He couldn't go to the Ordnance Survey and say, "There's a deliberate error in one of my 1944 maps. Could you fix it?" That would mean disclosing a classified operation. The classification period hadn't expired, so he said nothing. And the map stayed. He knew it was there. He knew exactly which drawer, which file, which reference number. He had put it there himself, and the number was wrong. Marsh returned to the Ordnance Survey after the war, back to making maps. Accurate maps. Precise maps. Maps checked and rechecked the way he had always checked them. His professional reputation remained exactly what it had been before the war. His colleagues described him the same way they always had. If George's map says it, the number is right. But in his diaries, which he kept with the same methodical care he brought to cartography, the map appears periodically. One entry reads, "Check the archive reference today. Still there, still wrong, 40 years. Another, wondering how many copies were made, how many analysts saw it, whether any of those copies are still somewhere in German records. And the entry that appears in slightly different form several times across 30 years of diaries. Wrong thing to do. No. Orders, wartime, lives saved. Right thing to do? I don't know. I've stopped being sure those two questions have the same answer. I want to stay with that diary entry for a moment. Wrong thing to do? No. Right thing to do? I don't know. Marsh is making a very specific distinction there, and it's a distinction that I think is worth taking seriously. Wrong in the sense of, did he break a rule, violate an order, act against his duty? No, he followed orders. He served his country. He did what he was told to do in a wartime context where the stakes were enormous. Right, in a different sense. Was it consistent with who he was, what he believed his work was for, what he would have chosen to do if no one had asked him? That's a different question. And Marsh, across 30 years of diary entries, couldn't answer it. I find that more honest than either of the easy answers would have been. He could have told himself, I was ordered to, so I'm not responsible. He didn't. He could have told himself, it saved lives, so of course it was right. He didn't do that either. He just sat with the question for decades without resolving it. What do you think? Can those two questions, wrong and right, have different answers? Drop it in the comments and subscribe. Hit the bell. These stories deserve the conversation they get in the comments. 1987. The classification periods had expired. Marsh was 76 years old. He wrote a letter to the Ordnance Survey. It was precise, formal, careful, the language of a man who had spent his career communicating clearly about technical matters. He described the specific map, gave its archive reference number, explained that it contained a deliberate error introduced as part of Operation Bodyguard, noted that the relevant classification period had lapsed, and proposed either that the map be corrected or that it be marked with a notation explaining its status as wartime deception material. The Ordnance Survey replied. They thanked him for his service. They acknowledged his communication. They explained that the map in question had been superseded by newer surveys decades earlier and was retained in the archive only as a historical document, and they added a line that Marsh recorded in his diary with a specific notation. They said they could not account for all copies. They could not account for all copies. Marsh wrote, expected but still unsettling. The copies question stayed with the Marsh for years. During the war, that map had been reproduced. How many copies? Unclear. The operational records that would answer this are still classified or have been destroyed. The copies that were intended to reach German intelligence reached German intelligence, at least in part. That much is documented. But there were other copies. British planning archives, Allied coordination files, and after the war, academic researchers working on D-Day history, analysts studying Bodyguard, military historians examining the deception operations components. Some of those researchers may have seen Marsh's map. Some may have noted the water depth at that location. Some may have cited it in their own work without knowing it was wrong. A wrong number copied can travel. Marsh's diary. You make an error and you correct it. There's a path from mistake to correction. But when you make a deliberate wrong, and copies of that wrong scatter across the world, you can't follow them. You can only know they exist. What Marsh's story illuminates about cartography specifically is worth spending a moment on. Maps have a specific authority that other documents don't entirely share. A map presents itself as a record of reality. When you look at a map, the basic assumption, the social contract of cartography, is that what is shown on the map corresponds to what exists in the world. The number 5 means 5, not approximately 5, not 5 for operational reasons, not 5 because someone decided 5 was more useful than 8. 5. This is why deliberate errors on maps are a different category from, say, deliberate errors in intelligence reports, or in radio signals, or in the testimony of double agents. Those are understood to be potentially false. Their falseness is, in a sense, part of their genre. Intelligence can be wrong. Agents can lie. Maps are supposed to be true. Marsh understood this. The reason the wrong number worked. The reason a German analyst would look at 5 feet and accept it as evidence was precisely because maps had this authority. Because everyone in the room trusted that number the way they trusted the number on a measuring stick. And Marsh had used that trust to deceive. For good reasons. For the best possible reasons. But he had used it. How much did Operation Bodyguard actually contribute to D-Day's success? This is a question military historians have worked on for decades, and there isn't a clean answer. Deception operations are structurally difficult to evaluate because you can never run the counterfactual. You can't see what would have happened without them. What we can say with reasonable confidence: the German 15th Army remained in the Pas de Calais for weeks after the Normandy landings. It was the strongest German formation in France. If it had moved to Normandy in the first days after June 6th, the Allied beachhead would have faced a significantly more powerful counterattack. Whether it stayed in place because of Bodyguard specifically, or because of Hitler's personal command decisions, or because of the general confusion of the German command structure in France, or some combination of all three, that's genuinely unclear. But the consistent false picture that Bodyguard built, the one that said the real invasion was still coming at Pas de Calais, contributed to the environment in which those command decisions were made. And Marsh's 5 feet was one thread in that picture. A small thread, one number on one map, but part of the fabric that held together a deception that may have been decisive. 2003, Marsh's family donated his diaries to the Cornwall Archive. 2009, a researcher working on Allied deception operations in the Second World War found the archive. Read the diaries, found the references to the map, checked the Ordnance Survey archive, found the map, found the 5 feet, found Marsh's 1987 letter in the Ordnance Survey's own files, with their response attached. Published a short paper in 2011, the first public account of what Marsh had done. The map has not been corrected. It remains in the archive as a historical document, with a water depth of 5 feet at one specific location on a section of the Normandy coast, wrong in exactly the way it was designed to be wrong. Marsh died in 1994. He was 83 in Cornwall, near the coast where he'd grown up. In his final years, he rarely left the house, but he walked the coastal path when he could. He watched the tides. He kept tide tables. Habit, decades old, couldn't stop. A neighbor who knew him in those years gave a brief account that appeared in a local history piece after his death. George loved maps. He had them everywhere. But once he said something I've always remembered. He said, "Even the best map is wrong somewhere. It shows too much or too little. Or sometimes it's wrong on purpose." He laughed after he said it, but his eyes didn't. His eyes didn't. Let me ask you one final question. That map is still sitting in the archive, flagged as a historical document, never corrected. 5 feet still there. It's harmless now. Nobody is planning a beach landing based on a 1944 coastal survey. The wrong number doesn't endanger anyone. But it's still wrong. And here's the question I keep coming back to. When a historical document contains a deliberate error, an error that was right for its time, that served a purpose, that may have contributed to saving lives, should it be corrected? Or should it remain as it is, wrong and all, because the wrongness is part of what it is and part of what it records? I don't think there's a clean answer, but I think the question is worth asking, and I think Marsh would have appreciated someone asking it. Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Share this with someone who thinks about truth and maps and the spaces between them. George William Marsh's name doesn't appear in the standard histories of D-Day. D-Day has its famous stories. Eisenhower's letter taking responsibility for failure, written the night before in case it was needed. The paratroopers dropping into the dark. The first wave at Omaha, the Mulberry Harbors. The logistics of the largest military operation in history. And somewhere in the margins of all of that, a cartographer. 3 weeks of work. One wrong number. That number is still in the archive. Still wrong. Wrong in exactly the right way at exactly the right time for exactly the right reasons. And a man spent 50 years asking himself whether those reasons were enough. Wrong thing to do? No. Right thing to do? I don't know. I've thought about that question a lot since I first encountered this story, and I keep arriving at the same place Marsh arrived at. Those are two different questions. They don't have to have the same answer. The map worked, the deception worked, the invasion succeeded. Lives were saved. And one man alone in an archive spent half a century knowing that somewhere in the official record of British cartography, under his name, there was a 5 where there should have been an 8. Not because he made a mistake, because he made a choice and carried it. If this one got to you, hit the like button. Subscribe for more every day. I find the stories that ended up in one wrong number on one archive map. Ring the bell. Share this with someone who should think about it.